There's not much more to write about director Stanley Kubrick than what's already been written. His work has been analyzed, pored over, and dissected as long as it's been around. He's held up as the gold standard in filmmaking, the benchmark by which all other directors aspire to, and all critics compare against. Each of his major films, from 1956's The Killing to 1999's Eyes Wide Shut, can be considered masterpieces in their own right, possessing lurid qualities that continue to draw us into Kubrick's meticulously crafted worlds and beckon us to uncover their secrets. He was a calculating genius in every sense of the term, seemingly born as a fully formed artist. Kubrick's sterling legacy is somewhat ironic, considering that most of his films were misunderstood, controversial, and lukewarmly received upon their release. It wasn't until many years later that his work achieved the kind of cultural value and respect it holds now. The controversy over his work would turn Kubrick into a recluse late in life, which projected a great air of mystery and myth about him. Indeed, many of his fans didn't even know what he looked like. While the details of his later years are closely guarded family secrets, Kubrick's early life is well documented in the public forum. He was born in New York City in 1928 to Jacob Leonard Kubrick, a prominent doctor, and his wife Sadie Gertrude Kubrick. The Kubricks were of Polish, Austrian, and Romanian descent, and they identified as ethnically Jewish, although they did not raise Stanley as religious. As a bookish lad growing up in the Bronx, Kubrick wasn't interested in the normal mischievous pursuits of boyhood. He was obsessed with chess, which his father taught him at the age of 12. He appreciated the game's emphasis on patience and discipline, traits that would mark his filmmaking style later on. His love of visual art began at age 13 when his father gave him a still camera and encouraged an interest in photography. The teenage Kubrick was more interested in jazz drumming and catching double features at the local cinema instead of attending school, where he wasn't much of a model student. His poor grades, combined with the influx of returning World War II vets in 1945, pushed him out of the opportunity to attend college after graduation. To compensate, he took night classes at City College of New York while working as a freelance photographer by day. In 1946, he became an apprentice photographer for the prestigious Look magazine, and it wasn't long until he was promoted to full-time staff. He married his high school sweetheart Toba Metz in 1948, and they moved into the Greenwich Village neighborhood in Manhattan. It was around this time that Kubrick began frequenting film screenings at the Museum of Modern Art and became enamored by the works of directors like Max Ophuls and Elia Kazan. While most of his formative years were spent developing a love for image making, it was only around the late 1940s that his ambitions coalesced into a firm desire to make cinema. Kubrick's first foray into the moving image is relatively nondescript and pedestrian, an independently financed newsreel intended for distribution by the March of Time series. Essentially working on spec, Kubrick based Day of the Fight off of an earlier photo feature he had done for Look magazine in 1949, on Irish middleweight boxer Walter Cartier.
Walter is on the right of Vincent, his identical twin. He doesn't mind the hard training, the 4 miles of road work every day, as much as the waiting.
The short film follows Cartier on the day of his big fight against fellow middleweight Bobby James on April 17, 1950. Kubrick and his small crew shot Day of the Fight using specialized daylight loading cameras that took 100-foot spools of black and white 35mm film. The camera work is extremely conservative, confined to a static tripod except for a single shot that is executed with a subtle dolly. What Kubrick lacks in style and finesse, he makes up here in excellent visual sensibility. His background in photography gives him the capability to imbue a compelling depth in his compositions, as well as an inherent understanding of light and its importance in storytelling. Narrated by Douglas Edwards and scored by Kubrick's childhood friend Gerald Fried, Day of the Fight falls very much in line with newsreel shorts of the day.
24 years are a long time, but in a way that's gone pretty quickly for a couple of boys. It's only when you want the hours to go, like now, that time has a way of staring you in the face as it barely moves along.
Kubrick's efforts turned out successful when he sold Day of the Fight to RKO for $4,000. He only made a profit of $100 after his out-of-pocket production expenses of $3,900 were recouped, but he had managed to establish himself as a working director and start his career off on a strong note. Kubrick's second newsreel short, Flying Padre, was also created in 1951 and features Father Fred Stadtmuller as its subject, a priest whose parish is so spread out he must fly a small plane to get wherever he's needed. Produced by Burton Benjamin and narrated by CBS announcer Bob Haidt, Flying Padre is similar in style to Day of the Fight and other newsreels of the day. Shooting again on black and white 35mm film, Kubrick makes use of the bright, even light of the prairie, evoking the earnest sensibilities of a Western film, whereas Day of the Fight's treatment of light resembled film noir. The camera, locked to a tripod, is observational and unobtrusive, save for one striking shot at the very end, where it tracks backwards away from Father Stadtmuller and his plane. This is the earliest instance of a shot that Kubrick would employ to striking effect throughout his work, helping to define his style as a director.
His destination is Tucumcari, where an ambulance is waiting at the airport to rush the child to a hospital.
One of Kubrick's defining signatures, the thematic exploration of man's relationship to technology, begins here, with an in-depth look at how the modern miracle of flight enables Father Stadtmuller to overcome the intimidating challenges of tending to such a large parish. Day of the Fight and Flying Padre are highly representative of Kubrick's humble journeyman beginnings. These newsreel shorts are devoid of style, feeling very much like a bland product of the establishment, a nebulous entity that Kubrick would very soon turn on and stake his career against. Aspiring directors making their first features under scrappy, shoestring budgets is a grand tradition within the art of cinema. Oftentimes, directors' first films are their most electrifying. Scorsese, Coppola, Cassavetes, Lynch, Malick, any major director born after World War II that you could think of, odds are they have a scrappy, rough-around-the-edges feature at the beginning of their filmographies. All of those films, and their maverick makers, owe a debt of gratitude to what could perhaps be considered the original indie debut, Kubrick's Fear and Desire.
There is war in this forest, not a war that has been fought, or one that will be, but any war. And the enemies who struggle here do not exist unless we call them into being. This forest, then, and all that happens now, is outside history. Only the unchanging shapes of fear and doubt and death are from our world.
Set in an unnamed country during an unnamed conflict, Fear and Desire uses the generic idea of combat to better access its psychological undercurrents, as it tells the story of a small squadron of 4 men who must find their way back home after crash landing behind enemy lines. Just 25 years old at the time, Kubrick quit his job as a photographer at Look magazine to focus on the project full-time, acquiring the financing when his father cashed in his life insurance policy, and his uncle chipped in some earnings from his pharmaceutical business. Kubrick recruited Howard Sackler, a high school classmate and aspiring poet, to write the screenplay. Kubrick shot the film silently, as a way to stretch his meager $13,000 budget, but he hadn't planned on the expensive necessity of redubbing the actors' lines in a studio. Kubrick's cast is comprised mainly of unknowns, headed up by Kenneth Harpe and Frank Silvera. Harpe is styled in the vein of the traditional romantic hero archetype common in mid-century American cinema, confident and virtuous, but ultimately quite vanilla and devoid of any sort of edge. Silvera plays another large archetype, the gruff and tough military man, disgruntled by his long experience in the armed forces. Paul Mazursky, who would later go on to become a film director in his own right, plays a squirrely young recruit who is so affected by his transgressions against a local native girl that he ultimately goes mad, calling to mind shades of the Renfield character in Dracula.
Rats! Thousands! Millions of them!
In a move befitting a shoestring budget indie feature, Kubrick performed most of the duties of a film crew himself, with only his wife, Toba Metz, serving as script supervisor, Herbert Lebowitz working as the production designer, and a crew of Mexican day laborers acting as impromptu grips. Kubrick also served as his own cinematographer and editor, shooting the film in black and white, mostly for budgetary reasons, but also because he could maximize his experience in lighting for black and white photography so as to achieve more of a professional look. Kubrick and company shot on Southern California's San Gabriel Mountains, with the lack of conventional resources severely limiting their shooting style. Special effects were improvised, with equipment like a crop sprayer for smoke and fog, which naturally made the cast and crew violently ill, or repurposing a baby carriage as a dolly. Kubrick's eye, for the most part, is quite competent and is able to recognize compelling framing here. However, it's evident that the young filmmaker hadn't quite grasped the concept of eye lines and spatial geometry. This translates to a rather jarring and incoherent edit, where Kubrick routinely cuts away to close-ups that are framed in awkward angles or brazenly cross the 180-degree line.
It's better. It's better to roll up your life into one night and one man and one gun. It hurts too much to keep hurting everyone else in every direction.
When combined with a thick layer of overwrought, existential voiceover that tries hard at sounding profound, only to come off as hackneyed and trite, it's easy to see why Kubrick would strive so hard to keep Fear and Desire from being seen by mass audiences.
And nobody alive can tell which is which.
Violence and sex, admittedly, are two polar extremes in the spectrum of human experience, and two of the most potent, uncontrollable forces we will experience in our own lifetimes. Fear and desire serves as our first true taste into Kubrick's mentality towards those two forces. The violence in Fear and Desire is rather surface level, but Kubrick films it in a particularly expressionistic way. One memorable instance occurs halfway through the film when the squadron storms a small guard outpost and kills the guard within. Instead of showing us the explicit act of a knife sliding into the belly of a hapless soldier, Kubrick shows us an extreme close-up of the orange the soldier had been eating prior to being unexpectedly ambushed. His fist squeezes the orange ever tighter until it bursts, spilling juice all over his hand and the floor. Frankly, it's hard to think of a more graceful and fitting way to communicate the traumatic explosion of a soul as it's extinguished against its will. Fear and Desire explores sexuality during the sequence where the squadron ties a native girl to a tree so that she won't give away the presents to the enemy. Kubrick makes his audience complicit with the squadron's most primitive instincts and desires by repeatedly cutting to close-ups of the girl's lips, eyes, hands, etc. Kubrick casts each body in the harsh light of the male gaze, and it is this same sexuality that the girl uses to free herself from her bonds and make her ill-fated escape.
Come back! Don't tell the general! I won't hurt you!
The consequences of this development caused Paul Mazursky's Private Sidney to lose himself in the grips of madness, yet another big theme present throughout Kubrick's work: dehumanization and mankind's mental frailty against forces that are much larger than them, forces which are more often than not supernatural in origin. In Fear and Desire, for instance, the squadron encounters their lookalikes at the enemy base, which references the folklore of doppelgangers. The subsequent murder of their lookalikes at their own hands throws the surviving members of the squadron into an existential funk at the end of the film, where they ruminate on the true cost of warfare and whether they can ever truly bring themselves back from the brink they experienced behind enemy lines.
Come on, let's go.
As Kubrick developed as an artist, he came to see Fear and Desire as an embarrassment, denouncing it as such in public interviews and burying any possibility of further public screenings by burning the negative. For decades, Fear and Desire was touted as Kubrick's lost film, and the only way to see it was via the Kubrick estate, or, more recently, a poor-quality VHS bootleg with Italian subtitles uploaded to YouTube. Thankfully for us, and unfortunately for Kubrick, a print was found recently in the George Eastman Kodak archives and restored to its original glory, released publicly through Kino Lorber and the Library of Congress. While the ethics of going against the wishes of a deceased filmmaker is another conversation unto itself, Fear and Desire is nonetheless an important document in the history of cinema that should be preserved. The release of Fear and Desire came amid a tumultuous period of Kubrick's life. He had divorced Toba Metz shortly after production wrapped, and by this point had remarried to an Austrian-born dancer and theatrical designer named Ruth Sobotka. The finished feature was well received by critics of the day, who offered much more generous praise than the film probably deserved, but it fell far short in what the industry considers true success, box office. While Kubrick gained a good deal of new friends in the critics' circle, his phone wasn't exactly ringing off the hook with calls from Hollywood. For him, there was no turning back. He was now committed as a full-time filmmaker, and until he found success in that line of work, he would have to put food on the table with commissioned work instead. Luckily, he found such work fairly quickly in the form of The Seafarers, an industrial film for the Seafarers International Union.
I'm Don Hollenbeck. Joseph Conrad wrote a lot of things about the sea, and among other things, he wrote this: "The true peace of God begins at any spot 1,000 miles from land."
Hosted by CBS newscaster Don Hollenbeck, The Seafarers provides an in-depth look into the seafaring industry from a worker's perspective. Kubrick's treatment of the SIU headquarters makes it seem like something of a clubhouse, and considering the fact that the SIU's members are transient by the nature of the work, the headquarters would essentially need to function as such, a home away from home. The seafaring union and industry as a whole is treated as a very noble entity, committed to the betterment of its members and their families. As an industry film, it's fairly unremarkable, but it takes on a much more fascinating aura when viewed in the context of Kubrick's canon. Shot by Kubrick himself, the film is the director's first to be shot entirely on color 35mm film. Kubrick's confidence in cinematography comes from his background in black and white photography, but that confidence wavers somewhat in the transition to color. Utilizing a broad, even lighting scheme, Kubrick creates an image that's a little bit overexposed, but that could also admittedly be due to the print transfer of the film stock itself. Industry films are by their nature very dry and informational, and The Seafarers is no different in its emphasis on the communication of helpful information at the expense of Kubrick's personal artistic aesthetic. However, one of Kubrick's favorite camera moves, the slow long dolly shot, pops up during the cafeteria segment and gives us a clue as to the identity of the wizard behind the curtain. The Seafarers is also short on Kubrick's thematic fascination as an artist, but there are glimpses into the young director's developing psyche for those determined to wring meaning from insignificance. For instance, those wanting to see how Kubrick's exploration of technology and mankind's relationship to it is depicted in The Seafarers could look to the brief section on how the SIU incorporates machines into their daily operation. Likewise, one could point to the close-up of a poster in the barbershop featuring a nude pinup girl as evidence of Kubrick's fascination with complicated sexual mores. However, this is probably reading way too much into things. During this time, Kubrick was developing a follow-up feature with Fear and Desire's Howard Sackler, which he would eventually call Killer's Kiss. It was a tough, gritty story about an idealistic boxer raging against the criminal world as he attempts to extricate his love from their clutches. It was at once both a noir thriller and a romance whose mainstream sensibilities he hoped would bring him the success that had so far eluded him.
It's crazy how you can get yourself in a mess sometimes, and not even be able to think about it with any sense, and yet not be able to think about anything else. You get so you're no good for anything or anybody. Maybe it begins by taking life too serious. Anyway, I think that's the way it began for me.
Despite his ambitions, Kubrick's efforts were not on the most solid of foundations. The 26-year-old director was on welfare during production, and most of the financing was borrowed once again from his wealthy uncle, the owner of a prominent drugstore in the city.
You're doing all right for yourself.
What do you mean? Oh, he just lives in the building.
Oh. Used to be a pretty good fighter.
Frank Silvera is the only holdover talent from Kubrick's earlier feature, and he shows a decent amount of range as the seedy boss Vincent Rapallo. His worldly, weary cynicism serves as a decent foil to Jamie Smith's idealistic, naive boxer Davy Gordon.
Something's happened.
I know.
Do you know?
Sure. You kissed me.
Is that all?
That's all I saw, and I was watching all the time.
As a love interest Gloria Price, Irene Kane fills a necessary void in the story with a soft-edged femme fatale archetype that leaves a lot to be desired. Kubrick's wife, Ruth, makes a short cameo as Gloria's deceased sister, an accomplished ballerina, in a flashback sequence. Once again, Kubrick himself served as both the cinematographer and the editor. His background in photography serves him well here, with the cinematography being one of the film's strongest assets. The black and white 35mm film image might be cheap by its nature, but Kubrick imbues it with dark, rich shadows and a fantastic sense of depth that suggests a budget 3 times its size. Kubrick lights Killer's Kiss like a polished Hollywood noir film, creating evocative compositions whose deep focus draws us further into his world. The camera work matches this approach, such as in a moment when Kubrick slowly dollies down the length of a dance hall to add grandeur and scale despite the relative cheapness of the technique. Indeed, many of these shots were achieved from the back of a pickup truck, which came in handy when Kubrick's inability to secure location permits often necessitated a covert approach. Killer's Kiss stands out among Kubrick's filmography in that the polish is countered by a measure of spontaneity, a trait that Kubrick would abolish entirely in later works. The film cuts away to gritty street details quite frequently, giving us a sense of place and liveliness that one could see influencing a young John Cassavetes.
Come on, give me back the scar.
Kubrick's on-location depiction of New York stands as the most potent example of this dynamic. He makes great use of the dramatic skyline and looming architecture to add drama and grit, in the process capturing an authentic lived-in cityscape. Contrast these images with Kubrick's last work, Eyes Wide Shut, with New York streets being recreated on a soundstage so Kubrick could exert complete control over his shot. This approach extends to the boxing sequences, where Kubrick opts for a handheld documentary look, an expressionistic point of view angle that predate Martin Scorsese's dreamlike fight scenes in Raging Bull by 25 years. The expressionism on display also extends to a short dream sequence in which the camera screams down a long urban corridor at breakneck speed, the black and white image flipped to its negative. Visually arresting on its own, the shot anticipates the famous space tunnel sequence in 1968's 2001, A Space Odyssey, and is one of the earliest instances of Kubrick's fondness for one-point perspective in his compositions. Killer's Kiss serves as a neat little distillation of Kubrick's 2 main thematic fascinations, violence and sex. The boxing world is inherently violent, of course, but Kubrick's story seems to merge the 2 acts, one an act of destruction and the other an act of creation, until their boundaries blur ambiguously. In the world of Killer's Kiss, sex is violent and violence is intimate. Nowhere is this blur more apparent than in the film's climax, where the hero and the villain savagely duke it out against a backdrop of mannequins. Their cold, statuesque beauty echoes Gloria, and on a literal level, we're visually reminded that the 2 men are fighting over her as the ultimate prize. However, their presence underscores the intimate feminine aspect of violence. the aspect that requires the two fighters to lose themselves in the moment and express their feelings up close with their bodies. The climactic chase sequence also serves as an exploration of dehumanization, with the characters framed in wide shots, dwarfed by monolithic structures and cold, unfeeling cityscapes. Endless brick walls tower over them in an almost abstract fashion, heightening the hero's need to escape the city because his relative insignificance within it threatens to consume him entirely. For the longest time, Killer's Kiss was Kubrick's first official feature, and despite it being shot very similarly to Fear and Desire, Kubrick did not seem as embarrassed about the former's roughness and lack of polish. It's not hard to see that Killer's Kiss is a marked improvement over his earlier work, with his evolution very apparent in every frame. We can see that Kubrick's direction is much more confident, having grasped concepts like pacing and geography while coming up with creative, bold compositions. Killer's Kiss shows us a gifted young man coming into his own and starting to find his aesthetic, solidifying tastes that would inform one of the richest and most compelling filmographies the art form would ever see. The release of Killer's Kiss made a small splash in film circles, gaining its young director a modest amount of attention in the process. An upcoming young television producer named James B. Harris found his attention particularly captivated, and reached out to Kubrick with the proposal of a partnership. Working together as a producing team, Harris and Kubrick poured through mountains of material in search of their next story, eventually finding in Lionel White's crime novel Clean Break. After successfully licensing the film rights, Kubrick crafted the story into a script he called The Killing, which Harris then took to his contacts at United Artists. Only a year after the release of Killer's Kiss, Kubrick found himself prepping his next big project with the support of a respectable studio, a development that Kubrick must have found was equal parts blessing and curse. While the budget was barely enough for Kubrick to successfully realize his vision, he had access to the studio's expansive resource pool, and was able to inflate the production value using better cameras, lenses, and production design. However, this also meant that Kubrick now had to deal with unions, permits, and all the other aggravating aspects of filmmaking that hamper creativity. Despite these new challenges, Kubrick's third feature proved the young auteur's innate talent to a broader audience. The Killing may not be Kubrick's most famous film, but it serves as a high-quality genre exercise told in a challenging, unconventional way. More importantly, it marks Kubrick's emergence as a mature filmmaker and unparalleled storyteller.
Earlier that morning at 5 a.m., Red Lightning was fed only a half portion of feed in preparation for the 7th race that afternoon, the $100,000 Lansdowne Stakes. At 7 that morning, Johnny Clay began what might be the last day of his life.
Tied together with an omniscient narrator speaking in the third person, The Killing incorporates multiple points of view as it weaves a fractured narrative about a career criminal and his crew executing a $2 million heist at a popular racetrack. It's the perfect crime, both in conception and execution, and Kubrick's take on the story plays like something of a procedural, detailing the actions of each team member down to the minute.
It was 9:20 when he arrived at Mike's apartment. So far, everything had gone off according to plan.
Kubrick's churning narrative builds to an explosive finale that's capped by a twist of dark irony when the criminal finds that all the meticulous planning in the world can't account for the unpredictability of chance. The Killing marks the first time in which Kubrick's cast is comprised mainly of well-known professional actors and actresses. While this is ostensibly an ensemble film, the story belongs to Sterling Hayden, who ably projects the handsome crook at the center of the story.
These men are not going to be in on the basic scheme. They're getting paid to perform certain definite duties at a certain definite time, and they're not cutting in on the take. They'll be paid a flat price to do a straight job.
Kubrick surrounds Hayden with an assortment of well-known performers like Colleen Gray, Alicia Cook Jr., Marie Windsor, and Vince Edwards. There's also an appearance by contentious character actor Timothy Carey in the first of multiple performances under Kubrick's direction as an expert marksman with an unpredictable personality. The Killing's existence as a United Artists film meant that the production was a union job, which further meant that Kubrick had to hire an external director of photography the first time in his career. His choice was Lucien Ballard, a veteran cinematographer whose work he greatly admired. Their collaboration, however, was anything but harmonious. Director and cinematographer reportedly did not get along at all, with Kubrick's pursuit of visual perfection frequently ruffling Ballard's feathers. Despite this contentious relationship, The Killing's black and white 35mm film visuals are a thing of beauty. The first of Kubrick's works to be shot in the widescreen format, The Killing's 1:66:1 aspect ratio allows ample room for the young director's striking, depth-filled compositions. A low-key, high-contrast noir lighting approach gives the film a high-end pedigree, matched by elegantly complex camera moves.
Randy Kennan had some personal business to attend.
In his essay The Killing, Kubrick's Clockwork, writer Hayden Guest makes a clever observation about the hidden meaning behind the film's fluid dolly work when he writes, Ballard's gliding camera cuts a neat cross-section through a series of connected rooms in its path, transforming the apartment interior into a type of controlled tunnel that exactly describes and limits the possibilities of movement. A striking illustration of entrapment that subtly parallels the camera's and actors' tracks with those of the horse race. Indeed, the interior sets of The Killing, artfully designed by Kubrick's wife Ruth Sobotka as production designer, are reminiscent of a labyrinth, an idea that Kubrick would continue to revisit throughout his career. The layout of the rooms seemed to suggest a finite number of paths for the characters to take, dictating their movements and actions while assimilating them into a complex cosmic machinery that ultimately renders these same characters insignificant to the grand sweep of fate. Kubrick routinely takes what would otherwise be several shots and strings them together into one fluid take, and in the process discovers a proclivity towards complicated yet understated camera work that reinforces the story's themes and that would fundamentally inform his future work.
They got their problems, and they've all got a little larceny in them. How you feel?
Give me a double bourbon, please. Don't you think you've had enough, pal?
A further innovation of The Killings is its fractured, nonlinear narrative. As assembled by editor Betty Steinberg under Kubrick's supervision, we see the same scenes several times, but each revisit brings with it a new perspective from the vantage point of another character. As the drama and tension mount, we see conflicting details and snippets of crucial information that had previously, and strategically, been withheld. To their dismay, Kubrick and Steinberg were forced to go back and re-edit the film in chronological order after test audiences couldn't follow their original edit. Thankfully for us, their conventional edit proved to be even more of a mess, and their nonlinear cut was reinstated and released to theaters. The Killing's radical story structure, while owing a significant debt to the trail blazed by Akira Kurosawa in 1950's Rashomon, proved to be highly influential itself, with its influence felt in modern films such as Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs. Kubrick's career-long exploration into the psyche of violence and sex enjoys a brief respite in The Killing, with Kubrick toning down those fascinations to focus instead on delivering a taut genre picture. Kubrick's film is most assuredly a crime thriller, but he frequently finds opportunities to color outside the lines and subvert our expectations. This undermining of genre while simultaneously upholding it would be a trademark of Kubrick's for the rest of his career, a tangible method by which he could elevate the subject matter and make salient psychological points about the human condition. Additionally, Kubrick's knack for regularly creating indelible, iconic imagery begins in earnest with The Killing, not so much in specific shots, but in visual ideas. One of the film's most compelling images is the simple sight of the hauntingly blank clown mask that Hayden wears during the heist, which one could easily see influencing Christopher Nolan's bank heist introduction of the Joker in The Dark Knight. There's also the image of a vast portion of cash sucked up by a vortex of air and billowing away into nothing, a poetic and elegant visual metaphor for the film's central conceit that chaos and chance will always be there to ruin our best laid plans. The Killing is revered as an indispensable classic today, but few remember that it was effectively dumped by United Artists when it made its original release on the second half of a double bill, the equivalent of today's January-February release window. For most filmmakers, this would be death by poor box office, but Kubrick was not most filmmakers. The film didn't make much money, but those who saw it were blown away by the director's undeniable talent, and word of mouth spread through the upper echelons of Hollywood until it reached Kirk Douglas, the man who would take Kubrick's career to the next level. Watching The Killing with the luxury of hindsight, it becomes immediately apparent that this is truly Kubrick's first mature, fully realized film. More so than any other film in his canon, The Killing makes the case for Kubrick as the link between the old school, consummate craftsmanship of old Hollywood, a generation that influenced him immensely, and the radical innovation of new Hollywood, a generation that he would inspire directly.
Johnny, you've got to run.
What's the difference?